Shocking revelation. The strongest heart drug might be the one you eat. Heart disease fills hospital beds, yet 95% of us fail to eat enough fiber, the artery sweeper hiding in plain sight. Plants also come loaded with antioxidants and phytonutrients that can quiet inflammation within hours of a meal. In clinical trials, a plant-forward portfolio pattern dropped LDL cholesterol nearly 30%, a drug-level change without a prescription. So why do our plates still look beige while our arteries beg for color? Because the simplest fix is the one we've been trained to overlook. Here's the evidence. And the plate-by-plate playbook. At dawn in a cardiac ward, the monitors are already chattering, a metronome of lives on the line. The patients are younger than you might expect. Some are still answering work emails between tests. Heart disease is not the drama of a single terrible day so much as the slow arithmetic of years, and it remains the world's top killer. The World Health Organization estimates that cardiovascular diseases claim about 17.9 million lives each year, more than any other cause. In the United States, roughly 1 in 5 deaths is tied to the heart. Yet as the day's rounds begin, the conversation in exam rooms quickly turns to something both ordinary and stubbornly overlooked: what's on the plate. If lifestyle is medicine, diet is the dose we can't skip. The Global Burden of Disease study attributes roughly 11 million deaths worldwide to poor diet, more than to tobacco in some analyses, driven by too much sodium and not enough whole grains, fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, and fiber. Unlike a single workout or a single pill, eating is a decision we make 3 times a day, every day, and its effects accumulate in the bloodstream hour by hour. Meals shape LDL cholesterol, blood pressure, blood sugar, and inflammation. They either ease the workload of arteries or sand them down from the inside. That is why cardiologists increasingly talk about eating patterns, not just nutrients, because the pattern predicts the path toward plaque or away from it. Step outside the hospital and the numbers trace a familiar map. The modern Western diet leans hard on ultra-processed foods, high in refined starches, added sugars, salt, and industrial fats, and light on intact plants. In a large French cohort, every 10% increase in ultra-processed foods was associated with a 12% higher risk of cardiovascular disease. Americans, meanwhile, fall vastly short on fiber, a deficit that tracks with higher LDL and higher rates of coronary disease. None of this is abstract. In the grocery aisle, the cheapest calories are beige and shelf-stable, engineered to be craved and consumed quickly. The most protective foods, colorful produce, legumes, nuts, whole grains, require a different habit and, too often, a different budget. Environment tilts the table, but the biology is blunt. Patterns rich in plants tend to lower risk. Patterns dominated by ultra-processed and animal-heavy fare tend to raise it. The speed at which diet moves the needle can surprise even patients. In randomized trials, plant-forward eating patterns have produced changes measurable in weeks. The pre-dimed study in Spain, built around a Mediterranean template ladled with extra virgin olive oil or nuts, reported about a 30% relative reduction in major cardiovascular events among participants at high risk. In metabolic feeding studies, a portfolio of plant foods rich in viscous fiber, nuts, plant sterols, and soy-delivered drug-level drops in LDL cholesterol. Intensive lifestyle programs that centered on whole food, plant-based diets, together with stress management and activity, showed early signs of plaque regression on imaging and consistent improvements in angina and exercise capacity. None of these approaches is a magic trick. They simply change what the blood is carrying, meal by meal, and what the artery wall has to endure. Critics sometimes argue that diet is just one factor among many, and they're right. Genetics, stress, sleep, and movement matter. But few levers are as immediate and repeated as eating, and few touch as many pathways at once. Consider the daily cascade. Sodium nudges blood pressure upward. Saturated fat and certain refined carbohydrates push LDL and triglycerides higher. Added sugars and fast-digesting starches spike insulin and promote visceral fat. A lack of fiber starves the gut microbes that produce anti-inflammatory compounds. Conversely, the foods that dominate plant-rich plates supply the raw materials to quiet those same pathways. That is why a shift in diet, sustained and realistic, can rival the impact of adding a first medication, and why clinicians increasingly prescribe both. The question, then, is not whether food matters, but how to make it work for the heart in concrete, biological terms. What does a plant-forward plate actually do inside the artery? How does it lower LDL, dampen inflammation, and help the lining of blood vessels keep blood flowing smoothly? That is where the mechanism meets the menu and where the story turns from risk to repair. By the time clinic opens, the coffee is cooling and the morning's first patient is already on the ultrasound table for a quick look at the brachial artery. It's a routine test. Inflate a cuff, let it down, watch the vessel dilate, and a quiet proxy for how the body's inner highways are coping with everyday life. The images are rarely dramatic, but they tell a simple story with high stakes. What you eat changes how your arteries behave, sometimes within hours. Over weeks and months, a plant-forward plate exerts its power along three intertwined routes, lowering LDL cholesterol, dampening the inflammatory sparks that roughen artery walls, and restoring the endothelial lining's ability to keep blood moving without friction. Start with LDL, the courier most likely to overstay its welcome. On plant-rich diets, LDL falls for straightforward reasons. Replacing saturated fats from red and processed meats with unsaturated fats from olive oil, nuts, and seeds nudges the liver to clear LDL particles more efficiently. Add plant sterols and stanols, naturally present in seeds, nuts, and fortified foods, and the intestine absorbs less cholesterol in the first place. In controlled feeding studies, a portfolio of plant strategies has lowered LDL as much as some first-line drugs, about 5 to 10% with viscous fibers alone, 8-10% with plant sterols, 5 to 7% with nuts, and a few percent more with soy protein. Stacked together, the reductions compound. The mechanism is mechanical as much as metabolic. Soluble fibers bind bile acids, the liver pulls more LDL from circulation to replenish them, and the bloodstream grows clearer of the particles that seed plaque. But risk doesn't ride only on cholesterol, it's also carried on flames too small to feel. After a typical high-saturated fat, high-sugar meal, lab markers of inflammation and oxidative stress jump, and the immune system's sentry cells become stickier, primed to latch onto vessel walls. In contrast, meals built around vegetables, legumes, whole grains, fruits, and herbs blunt that response. Polyphenols in berries and cocoa, carotenoids in leafy greens and orange vegetables, and a spectrum of plant compounds act as antioxidants in the bloodstream and as signal modulators inside cells, dialing down pro-inflammatory pathways such as NF-κB. In large trials of Mediterranean-style eating, participants see consistent drops in high-sensitivity C-reactive protein, a marker tied to cardiovascular risk even when weight barely changes. The effect is less about a single superfood than about frequency. Fewer inflammatory surges, meal after meal, means less cumulative damage to the artery wall. That calmer biochemical weather is good news for the endothelium, the single-cell lining that decides whether vessels constrict or relax. On plant-forward diets, endothelial function improves, a change visible to clinicians as better flow-mediated dilation on ultrasound. Nitrate-rich greens like spinach and arugula boost nitric oxide, the molecule that signals arteries to open on demand. So do beets and certain herbs. Flavanol-rich foods, from tea to dark chocolate, have shown short-term improvements in vessel responsiveness, while diets higher in unsaturated fats reduce the oxidative stress that would otherwise degrade nitric oxide. Blood pressure tends to edge downward too, lowering sheer mechanical strain on the vascular system. It's not a miracle. It's maintenance, keeping the Teflon-like lining smooth, slick, and responsive. The translation from mechanism to life can look like this. A 52-year-old sales manager, statin intolerant, told to try food first for 12 weeks. He swaps his lunchtime deli meat for bean and grain bowls, brings a bag of nuts to work, doubles his greens at dinner, and learns to like steel-cut oats. By the follow-up visit, his LDL is down 30-35 mg/dL, blood pressure is 8 points lower, and his high-sensitivity CRP has halved. One patient does not make a study, but his arc mirrors what the literature has seen when plants move from garnish to centerpiece. If the strategy sounds broad, the levers are surprisingly specific. Among the most potent is also the most neglected: soluble fiber, the quiet scaffolding in oats, beans, lentils, and apples that recruits both the gut and the liver into cholesterol control. That's where the numbers, and our plates, so often fall short, and where the details matter next. On a rainy Tuesday in Cleveland, a hospital dietitian named Carmen Alvarez stands in a grocery aisle holding a bag of old-fashioned oats like a prop in a courtroom. "This," she tells a patient on speakerphone, "is a cholesterol trap you can eat for breakfast." It's not a metaphor. Soluble fibers, the gel-forming kind in oats, beans, lentils, and apples, bind bile acids in the gut, escort cholesterol out of the body, and force the liver to pull more LDL out of circulation to rebuild its bile pool. The mechanism is humble, almost mechanical, but its effects are visible in the lab. Meta-analyses show that about 3 grams a day of oat beta-glucan can reduce LDL cholesterol by roughly 5 to 7%. Add a serving of pulses, beans, lentils, chickpeas, most days, and the drop ticks down a few more points. It's the kitchen version of leverage, small changes, repeated, that move a stubborn number. The need for leverage is steep. By estimates drawn from national nutrition surveys, about 95% of Americans fall short of daily fiber recommendations. 25 grams for most women, 38 grams for most men, consuming on average barely 15 to 18 grams a day. That shortfall isn't just a missed opportunity for regularity. It's a missed defense for the arteries. Soluble fibers like beta-glucan, oats, barley, pectin, apples, citrus, and galactomannans, legumes, thicken with water into a viscous gel that slows digestion, blunts post-meal blood sugar spikes, and traps bile acids. Over weeks, the chemistry adds up to lower LDL, better glycemic control, and often a modest nudge down in blood pressure. Some clinicians now prescribe a daily fiber target as explicitly as they do a statin dose, and in statin-intolerant patients, psyllium, a supplemental soluble fiber, has delivered LDL reductions in the 5 to 10% range. The gut does not merely ferry fiber along, it transforms it. In the colon, microbes ferment soluble fibers into short-chain fatty acids, acetate, propionate, and butyrate, that act like diplomatic envoys between diet and metabolism. Butyrate fuels the cells lining the colon and supports a less inflammatory terrain. Propionate travels to the liver, where it appears to modestly dampen cholesterol synthesis. Acetate circulates widely and may help signal satiety. The result is a quieter immune profile, lower levels of inflammatory markers in some trials, and better insulin sensitivity. The kind of shift that lightens the cardiometabolic load long before a scan would show it. In diet switches that boost legumes and whole grains, researchers find increases in beneficial bacteria such as bifidobacteria and a rise in fecal short-chain fatty acids, a microbial fingerprint associated with better cardiovascular markers. Consider the mechanics in practice. A 43-year-old public school teacher, newly motivated after a brother's scare, follows a simple plan from her clinic: oatmeal with sliced apple in the morning, lentil soup or a bean salad at lunch, and a vegetable-forward dinner over intact grains instead of white pasta. She keeps a jar of chickpeas in the fridge and a bag of walnuts in the desk drawer. 12 weeks later, her labs show LDL down by 22 mg/dl, fasting glucose trimmed by a few points, and high-sensitivity CRP, an inflammation marker, cut nearly in half. She hasn't counted calories, only kept her eye on fiber, and her plate looks closer to her grandmother's than to a diet book's. For many patients, this is less a program than a pattern. When soluble fibers become default, LDL comes along for the ride. There is a subtler dividend, too, in the way fiber reshapes meal dynamics. By slowing gastric emptying, viscous fibers help rein in the post-meal surge of triglyceride-rich particles that can stress the endothelium. They increase the release of satiety hormones such as GLP-1 and PYY, which not only make it easier to step away from the snack drawer, but also have downstream benefits for glucose management. And by altering the gut environment, pH, bile acid composition, microbial residence, higher fiber diets may reduce levels of TMAO, a gut-derived metabolite linked in some studies to atherosclerosis, although that line of research is still evolving. The consistent theme is directional. Fiber slides a series of sliders, lipids, inflammation, glycemic response, toward a safer range. Skeptics sometimes point out that not all fibers are equal, and they're right. The cholesterol-lowering punch is concentrated in viscous types, the ones that gel. Think the beta-glucan that gives oatmeal its creaminess, the pectin that helps a fall apple set into jam, the soluble fractions in beans that turn brothy liquid slightly silky. That's why food patterns matter. A fiber supplement without a shift in overall diet can help, but a kitchen that regularizes oats, pulses, and fruit builds multiple scaffolds at once. For those who need a target, clinicians often coach toward at least 5 to 10 grams a day of viscous fiber within a broader 25 to 38 gram total, numbers that can be met with a bowl of oats, a cup of lentils, and an apple or two. None of this is glamorous. It asks for soaking beans on a Sunday and letting oatmeal simmer 5 extra minutes, but the return is biochemical and bankable, and it arrives quickly enough to show up on a lab report before enthusiasm fades. When the gel in your bowl has become less LDL in your blood and a calmer message to your immune system, breakfast starts to feel like a decision with consequence. And once the scaffolding is in place, another layer of protection becomes easier to appreciate. The antioxidants and plant compounds in berries, leafy greens, herbs, and teas that disarm oxidative stress after meals and help vessels stay supple. That is the other half of the plate, worth understanding next. In a quiet metabolic ward at mid-morning, a lab tech sets a timer and labels vials as volunteers cycle through a familiar sequence. Eat, wait, draw blood. The meal, a deliberately heavy high-fat plate, mimics a typical drive-through lunch. Within an hour, the lab instruments register a predictable spike, reactive oxygen species rising, LDL particles turning more vulnerable to oxidation, the chemical wear and tear that makes artery walls less responsive. Run the same drill a week later, this time with a bowl of berries and a pot of tea folded into the menu, and the curves flatten. The vessels measured by flow-mediated dilation relax more easily. Markers of oxidative stress are lower. It doesn't make headlines, but it does make a point. What you pair with your meal can change the biochemical weather of your bloodstream before the dishes are cleared. Oxidative stress is the immediate turbulence that follows many meals, especially those rich in saturated fat and refined starch. Free radicals, highly reactive molecules, chew through delicate lipids and proteins, including LDL, and they steal nitric oxide, the gas that signals arteries to open. Antioxidant-rich plants meet that surge where it starts. Blueberries have been shown in randomized trials to improve endothelial function within 2 hours of eating, with effects that track the dose of polyphenols circulating in the blood. Tea, black or green, carries catechins and theaflavins that both scavenge reactive species and appear to help the body make and preserve nitric oxide. Meta-analyses link regular tea drinking to modest improvements in vessel responsiveness and small but meaningful drops in blood pressure. Even something as straightforward as a salad built with leafy greens raises vitamin C and carotenoid intake enough to reduce the oxidation of LDL in short-term studies. Olive oil offers a lesson in quality over quantity. In sub-analyses of Mediterranean diet trials, versions rich in polyphenols, peppery extra virgin oils, reduced oxidized LDL and improved endothelial measures more than refined oils with the same calories and fat. Nuts add to the effect, likely through a combination of vitamin E, polyphenols, and arginine, a nitric oxide precursor. Herbs are concentrated sources too. Rosemary, thyme, and oregano pack rosmarinic and carnosic acids that slow lipid oxidation. Cocoa delivers flavanols that repeatedly, in controlled trials, bump up flow-mediated dilation after a single serving. None of this turns dinner into a supplement pill. It turns dinner into a biochemical buffer. The biology behind the buffer is simple enough to diagram on a napkin. After a rich meal, enzymes and lipoproteins churn out triglyceride-laden particles that drift through the bloodstream. Immune cells patrol, ready to adhere to vessel walls if they sense trouble. Reactive oxygen species feed that vigilance, activating inflammatory signaling and degrading nitric oxide into inactive byproducts. Antioxidants interrupt the cascade. They neutralize radicals, lower the chance that LDL becomes oxidized and lodged under the arterial lining, and protect nitric oxide so the endothelium can do its job, keeping blood flowing, pressure stable, and surfaces slick, not sticky. In parallel, many plant compounds upregulate the body's own antioxidant defenses. Enzymes like glutathione peroxidase and superoxide dismutase. So the effect extends beyond the meal by training the system to be less combustible. The real-world translation arrives in small rituals. A cup of green tea with lunch, a handful of berries folded into yogurt, a plate that skews toward darker greens, spinach, kale, arugula, dressed with extra virgin olive oil and lemon, herbs thrown with a generous hand. In clinics, patients who adopt these patterns often see lab changes that outpace the scale: lower oxidized LDL, steadier blood pressure, better endothelial function, because the target is the meal-to-meal volatility that ages vessels prematurely. These foods do not erase risk, and they do not replace prescribed medications, but they change the terrain on which those medicines work. It is tempting to reduce all of this to antioxidants mop up bad molecules, but the story runs deeper than cleanup. The same compounds that tint berries blue and greens dark also speak the body's signaling language, toggling pathways that govern inflammation, lipid metabolism, and vascular tone. In other words, beyond blunting oxidative stress, specific phytonutrients act like cellular bodyguards. The next step is to meet them by name: flavonoids, carotenoids, lignans, and understand how they lean blood pressure and lipid profiles in the right direction. Late on a Thursday, the teaching kitchen at a community clinic smells like simmering tomatoes and torn basil. A cardiologist in rolled-up sleeves is explaining why the sauce's color matters as much as its salt, how the pigments in plants aren't decoration but instruction manuals for our cells. Scientists call them phytonutrients, a sprawling family that includes flavonoids, carotenoids, and lignans. They don't deliver calories. They deliver signals, quieting the immune alarms that inflame artery walls, nudging blood vessels to relax, and coaxing lipids into safer territory. Flavonoids are the versatile players, and berries are their headline act. The deep blues and reds of blueberries and blackberries come from anthocyanins, compounds linked in a large cohort of younger women to a 1/3 lower risk of heart attack among those who ate the most compared with the least. In the short term, controlled trials show that berry-rich drinks improve the ability of blood vessels to dilate within hours, mirroring rises in circulating anthocyanins. Other branches of the flavonoid family pull their weight too. Quercetin, the compound that gives onions and apples their bite, has produced modest reductions in systolic blood pressure in hypertensive patients in randomized trials. Cocoa flavanols, abundant in high cocoa dark chocolate and unsweetened cocoa, repeatedly improve flow-mediated dilation and nudge blood pressure down by a few points, an effect attributed to better nitric oxide signaling. Citrus adds flavonones. Tea contributes catechins. Together they form a web of small, consistent shifts that, over months and years, add up. Carotenoids bring a different palette and pathway. Lycopene, which concentrates in cooked tomatoes, has been associated with reductions in LDL cholesterol in meta-analyses and with less oxidation of LDL, making it less likely to burrow into artery walls. Lutein and zeaxanthin, the yellow pigments in leafy greens and corn, accumulate not only in the eye but also in arteries, where higher blood levels correlate with less arterial stiffness in observational studies. These compounds are fat-soluble, so the way we prepare them matters. Gentle cooking breaks down plant cell walls, and a drizzle of extra virgin olive oil helps ferry them into circulation. The old country habit of sautéing greens and finishing tomato sauce with oil turns out to be a delivery system, not just a tradition. Lignans, often overlooked, arrive quietly in seeds and grains. Flaxseed is the star here. In a 6-month randomized trial of patients with hypertension, adding milled flaxseed to daily meals led to significant drops in systolic blood pressure, on the order that clinicians typically expect from a first-line medication, with improvements larger among those starting with the highest pressures. Lignans from flax and sesame are converted by gut microbes into enterolignans, compounds that appear to lower inflammatory signaling and modestly improve lipid profiles. Observational data link higher enterolactone levels, a biomarker of lignin intake and microbial metabolism, with a lower risk of cardiovascular events, hinting at a microbiome-mediated route to vascular calm. What ties these families together is not just their ability to neutralize free radicals, important as that is, but their knack for talking the body's biochemical language. Flavonoids can downshift NF-κB, a master switch for inflammation, and upregulate endothelial nitric oxide synthase, the enzyme that helps vessels relax on cue. Carotenoids help stabilize cell membranes and may dampen expression of adhesion molecules that make white blood cells stick to the vessel lining. Lignans have been shown to influence enzymes involved in lipid metabolism and, in some studies, to reduce high-sensitivity C-reactive protein, a blood marker of arterial inflammation. The changes are rarely dramatic in isolation, which is why the story is less about a single hero and more about ensemble work, foods that stack complementary signals across meals. There are guardrails. Evidence favors foods over pills. Trials of beta-carotene supplements in smokers, for instance, infamously increase lung cancer risk, a reminder that removing one compound from its food context can backfire. Whole plants deliver phytonutrients wrapped with fiber, potassium, magnesium, and unsaturated fats, the very cofactors that help lower blood pressure and improve cholesterol ratios. And biology varies. Two people can eat the same salad and absorb different amounts of polyphenols or convert lignans differently depending on their microbiome. Diversity and repetition across the week are a practical hedge. Back in the kitchen, the sauce deepens in color as a resident grinds flaxseed for tomorrow's oatmeal and someone sets a colander of blueberries to drain. The plate taking shape is less a prescription than a pattern. Pigments across the spectrum, herbs liberally used, tea in place of soda. If these compounds can sway inflammation, pressure, and lipids dish by dish, the next question is whether entire eating patterns built around them change outcomes we care about: heart attacks, strokes, longevity. Decades of trials on Mediterranean, DASH, and portfolio-style diets have tried to answer exactly that. The question of patterns, not just parts, has been field-tested in real kitchens and controlled wards for decades. In a Barcelona classroom used for nutrition counseling during the pre-DIME trial, participants at high cardiovascular risk went home each month with either a sack of nuts or a tin of peppery, polyphenol-rich extra virgin olive oil and a simple mandate: eat this alongside a Mediterranean-style diet. Over nearly 5 years, their odds of heart attack, stroke, or cardiovascular death fell by roughly 30% compared with those told to follow a lower-fat diet. When questions later arose about randomization at a few sites, the investigators reanalyzed the data. The signal barely budged. The foods varied by taste and region, but the pattern was consistent. Plants at the center, olive oil as the main fat, nuts and legumes regular, fish preferred to red meat, sweets occasional. A continent away, in an NIH feeding center where meals were weighed to the gram, the DASH trial tackled a narrower target: blood pressure. Volunteers cycled through strict menus, one typical of American eating and another loaded with fruits, vegetables, and low-fat dairy, with whole grains, nuts, and legumes in steady rotation. In just 2 weeks, systolic pressure dropped by about 5 to 6 points on average, and by around 11 points in people with hypertension, numbers that clinicians associate with a meaningful cut in stroke risk. When sodium was stepped down in a companion study, the gains amplified. No supplements, no exotic ingredients, just a recalibration toward plants and away from sodium and saturated fat. Canada supplied a third line of evidence from a small metabolic ward with an outsized reputation for precision. In the portfolio studies led by David Jenkins, participants ate a carefully designed roster of cholesterol-lowering plant foods, viscous fibers from oats and barley, soy protein, almonds, and plant sterols. In a matter of weeks, LDL cholesterol plunged by roughly 25 to 30%, approaching the effect of an early statin. Later, in real-world conditions where adherence was imperfect, the pattern still trimmed LDL by about 13% at 6 months. The implication wasn't that drugs were obsolete, but that food could act on the same pathways and sometimes lighten the pharmacologic load. These trials didn't unfold in a vacuum. Cohort studies in the US and Europe, tracking tens of thousands of men and women for years, have repeatedly linked higher adherence to Mediterranean-like eating with lower rates of cardiovascular events and all-cause mortality, often on the order of 15 to 25%. The Lion Diet Heart Study, an earlier, smaller trial in French patients who had already had a heart attack, suggested substantial reductions in recurrent events when a Mediterranean pattern rich in alpha-linolenic acid took the place of a conventional low-fat diet. The exact numbers vary by study, but the themes align with the mechanisms already seen in the lab. LDL falls, blood pressure edges down, markers of inflammation such as high-sensitivity CRP lighten, endothelial function improves. Critics rightly note that diet trials are hard to blind and that culture, income, and access shape what ends up on the plate. Yet the consistency across methods and populations has been striking. Whether the lens is a randomized feeding study that controls every bite or a long follow-up of free-living adults, plant-rich patterns keep pointing the same direction. They offer something medicine usually admires: redundancy. Fiber works one way, phytonutrients another, potassium and magnesium a third, unsaturated fats a fourth. When they're present together, the effects add. And they're reinforced by cutting back on the very items that push risk the other way: sodium, refined starches, added sugars, and saturated fats. In clinics, this evidence has nudged practice from nutrient tinkering toward pattern-based prescriptions. A cardiologist might still count milligrams of sodium with a patient who retains fluid, but the broader strategy is to help them live inside a dietary architecture that makes the healthier choice default: vegetables and fruits in abundance, intact grains replacing refined flours, legumes as daily protein, nuts and seeds in place of processed snacks, olive oil instead of butter. The point is not to recreate a Spanish village or a Toronto test kitchen, it's to borrow their scaffolding. The next challenge is practical, not academic. Knowing that Mediterranean, DASH, and portfolio-style diets move hard outcomes is one thing. Arranging an ordinary Tuesday dinner so it does the same is another. The translation happens at the stove and the grocery shelf. How to build each meal around plants, then layer in herbs and spices for flavor while keeping salt and saturated fat in check. By 6:30 on a weekday evening, the community center's teaching kitchen in Minneapolis is full of people in office clothes and gym shoes. On the counter, bags of frozen broccoli, a heap of lemons, a colander of chickpeas, a pot of brown rice still steaming. "We're not cooking restaurant food," says the instructor, a former line cook who now works with cardiac rehab patients. "We're building a default." The default she means looks unglamorous on paper: vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, nuts, seeds, but it's the architecture that kept showing up in trials. The plate starts with plants and stays there, not as garnish but as the main act. What changes night to night is the map of the flavors. In practice, that architecture is visual. Half the plate vegetables and fruit in season or from the freezer, a quarter whole grains with their brand still on, a quarter legumes, beans, lentils, chickpeas, or tofu or tempeh. If fish or yogurt appears, it shares space. If meat shows up, it's an irregular guest. This proportioning isn't doctrine. It's a way to make the mechanisms tangible. More viscous fiber to bind bile, more potassium and magnesium to ease blood pressure, more polyphenols to calm post-meal turbulence, fewer sources of saturated fat and sodium to push the other way. The flavor is carried by herbs, spices, and acid, lemon, vinegar, tomatoes, not by the salt shaker or butter dish. Breakfast is where many clinics start because it sets the day's slope. Oats simmer with water until glossy, then get buried under blueberries, sliced apple, a spoonful of ground flaxseed, and walnuts. The sweetness comes from fruit, the richness from nuts and seeds. Coffee is still coffee, but it's flanked by a glass of tap water and, for some, a cup of tea. Lunch becomes a bowl more than a sandwich, a scoop of farro or brown rice, a tumble of roasted vegetables, a ladle of beans, herbs, and a drizzle of extra virgin olive oil brightened with lemon. Dinner is sheet pan cooking rather than deep frying. Cauliflower tossed with smoked paprika and cumin, chickpeas crisped at the edges, kale wilted down and glossed with garlic and a splash of vinegar. Salt is present but measured. A teaspoon contains about 2,300 milligrams of sodium, the recommended daily cap for most adults, and taste buds adapt within weeks when herbs and acids take the lead. The grocery math favors this direction. A pound of dried beans, under $2 in many stores, yields 6 to 7 cups cooked. Canned beans, rinsed under running water, shed up to 40% of their sodium and are ready in minutes. Frozen vegetables are often harvested at peak and can be cheaper than fresh. They go from freezer to skillet without waste. Bread and cereal shopping gets a simple newsroom test borrowed from epidemiologists, the 10.1 rule. For every 10 grams of carbohydrate, look for at least 1 gram of fiber on the label, a shorthand for whole grains that haven't been engineered back into starch. Olive oil replaces butter as the default cooking fat, but quantity still matters. Flavor comes from browned edges, toasted spices, and citrus zest more than from extra fat. Eating out doesn't break the pattern, it just asks for edits. Ask for vegetables to double as the side, oil and vinegar for dressing, sauces on the side so salt stays in check. Choose beans, lentils, or fish over red and processed meats when the menu allows. Swap a soda for unsweetened tea or water with a slice of lemon. None of these rules make a headline. Together they make adherence possible on a Tuesday when the fridge is bare and the day is run long. Clinicians watch the lab numbers tell the story back. A postal worker in his 50s, still on a moderate dose statin but stalled above target LDL, goes home with a simple brief. Build plates this way for 8 weeks. Don't chase perfection. Just make plants the default in season with herbs. He batch cooks beans on Sunday, keeps a jar of toasted seeds within reach, and learns to like chili garlic crunch more than bacon. 2 months later, LDL is down another 20 mg/dl, systolic blood pressure has dropped by 6 points, and the scale has barely moved. The gain isn't from hunger, it's from composition and the way meals now land on his arteries. There are caveats and tricks learned the hard way. People on anticoagulants need consistent, not absent, greens. Some salt substitutes contain potassium chloride and aren't appropriate for everyone. The point is to design a kitchen that reduces decision fatigue, a shelf with beans and intact grains, a freezer with vegetables, a bowl of fruit in sight, herbs and spices within reach. When flavor lives in plants, the rest of the pattern becomes harder to knock over. What the data have argued in cohorts and controlled wards becomes livable only when it's cooked and eaten repeatedly by people with jobs and kids and limited time. That is where risk turns into routine. The final question is less, does it work, than will you keep it up? And the answer lies in small systems and a starter plan that makes tomorrow's plate look a lot like today's, just as colorful.